Imagine you're a 21-year-old king standing at the edge of a raging river, staring across at an army that outnumbers you nearly 2-1. Your most trusted general is begging you to retreat. Your enemies are laughing from their impregnable position on the high ground. One wrong move and your empire dies before it's even born. But instead of backing down, you do something so insane, so audacious, that it will echo through history for over 2,000 years. You lower your spear, spur your horse forward, and lead a cavalry charge that should have been suicide. This is the moment Alexander the Great earned his name, and today we're diving deep into the battle that changed everything. But before we witness this legendary charge, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because you're about to discover why this single afternoon in 334 BC shaped the destiny of 3 continents. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The year is 334 BC, and the ancient world is a chessboard of empires, its pieces frozen in a moment of profound tension. For decades, a single, monolithic power has dominated the game, the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire. It is a colossus that sprawls from the shores of the Mediterranean deep into the heart of India, a tapestry of 12 nations and 100 peoples, all ruled by the King of Kings in his opulent palaces at Persepolis. To the world, this empire seemed eternal, its power absolute, its wealth unimaginable. But now a new piece has stormed onto the board. A young, unproven Macedonian king has crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army that is little more than a sliver of steel against the vastness of the continent. 35,000 men, carrying not just their sarissa spears, but the burning, century-old dream of their nation, revenge against the empire that had once burned Athens to the ground and humiliated Greece for generations. Alexander III of Macedon was not supposed to be here. By any rational measure, at just 21 years old, younger than many of the soldiers in his own phalanx, he should have been back in his volatile homeland, treading the careful path of a new monarch. His duties were clear: to quell the rebellious Greek city-states simmering to his south, to secure his northern borders against barbarian incursions, to learn the slow, grinding art of diplomacy and statecraft. But Alexander was not a rational man. He was a man possessed by a dream. He had emptied his treasury, borrowed against everything he owned, and gambled his entire kingdom on this single audacious roll of the dice. Now he faced his first true test. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor, princes of vast and wealthy domains, had gathered their forces at a place called the Granicus River. They were utterly confident, viewing this Macedonian upstart as a minor annoyance, a boy playing at war who could be swatted down and sent back across the sea in chains, ending this foolish invasion before it ever truly began. What happened next on that fateful afternoon would not only decide the fate of Alexander's invasion, but would echo through the halls of history for over 2 millennia. The engagement would become a blueprint for audacity, a masterclass in leadership, tactics, and the earth-shattering power of a single decisive action. It would be studied and revered, a lesson whispered in war colleges for centuries to come. But the legend was forged on the thinnest of margins. The grand tapestry of conquest that would see Greek culture spread to the ends of the known world almost unravelled before its first thread was even woven. In the chaos of the coming battle, Alexander would come within a single inch of bronze, a single heartbeat, of dying before his story ever truly began. On paper, the Persian strategy was a masterpiece of defensive warfare, a trap seemingly designed by the gods of war themselves. The satraps, the powerful regional governors of Asia Minor, had gathered a glittering host of approximately 40,000 troops. This army was anchored by its most feared component, 20,000 horsemen, a force that represented the very soul of the Persian military machine. These weren't conscripted riders. They were the high nobility of the empire, the sons of the Persian aristocracy, warriors from Media and Bactria who had been born into the saddle. They had trained from childhood in the brutal arts of mounted combat, and they arrived at the Granicus clad in the finest scaled armour and bronze helmets, a dazzling and terrifying wall of imperial power. But their true ace in the whole, the mind they hoped would guarantee their victory, was a man who was not even Persian. Standing among the silk-clad nobles was a Greek mercenary, a battle-hardened professional from the island of Rhodes named Memnon. He was no ordinary commander for hire. Memnon was a strategic genius, a man who possessed a chillingly accurate understanding of the Macedonian way of war, because he had fought both alongside and against them. He knew the devastating power of the Sarissa phalanx, but he also knew its weaknesses. In the Persian War Council, as the arrogant satraps debated how best to crush the young invader, Memnon, the voice of cold, hard experience, proposed a plan that should have stopped Alexander dead in his tracks. Memnon's strategy was as brutal as it was brilliant, a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. He argued for avoiding a direct, glorious battle at all costs. Instead, he advocated for a strategic retreat, a fighting withdrawal deep into the heartland of Asia Minor. As they fell back, they would implement a scorched earth policy, leaving nothing for the invaders. They would burn the crops in the fields, poison the wells, destroy the granaries, and evacuate the villages. Alexander's army, operating hundreds of miles from its nearest supply base with a treasury that was already empty, was a predator that needed a feed. Memnon's plan was designed to starve the beast. Cut off from all sources of food and forage, the Macedonian war machine would grind to a halt, forced into a humiliating retreat or a slow, agonizing death from starvation. It was the kind of unglamorous, patient, and ruthlessly effective strategy that wins wars. But the plan contained one fatal flaw. It required the Persian satraps to destroy the very source of their own immense wealth and power. These were proud, aristocratic men, governors of some of the richest provinces in the world, accustomed to a life of unparalleled luxury and prestige. The idea of setting fire to their own lush estates, their own bountiful fields, and their own prosperous cities was a personal and political insult they could not stomach. In the war council, their outrage was palpable. Arcetes, the satrap of the province where the battle would be fought, is said to have risen to his feet, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain, and declared that he would not allow a single house in the lands under his charge to be burned. It was a sentiment shared by his peers. More than that, their decision was poisoned by a lethal dose of arrogance. They saw Alexander not as the heir to Philip the King's revolutionary army, but as a boy king, an impetuous youth leading a barely stable kingdom. They believed the whispers from Greece that his rule was fragile, that this invasion was a desperate gamble. They craved the glory of crushing this upstart themselves, of presenting the head of the young Macedonian king to their ruler, Darius III, and claiming all the credit. Their pride, their greed, and their profound underestimation of their opponent led them to discard the one strategy that could have guaranteed victory. It was a collective, hubristic decision that would cost them everything. And so, they chose their battlefield with care. The Granicus River, though not especially wide, was a formidable natural fortress. For centuries the spring floods had gashed deep into the earth, creating steep, treacherous, mud-slicked banks that were nearly impossible to climb in formation. The current itself, fed by the cold mountain streams, ran swift and deep, a churning obstacle that could sweep a man or a horse off its feet. From their position on the eastern bank, the Persians held the high ground, giving them a commanding, unobstructed view of any approaching enemy. Their deployment was a direct reflection of their arrogance, unconventional, risky, and ultimately a catastrophic mistake. Standard military doctrine of the age dictated that infantry form the stable centre of a line, with cavalry held on the flanks or in reserve to deliver the decisive blow. The Persian satraps threw the textbook away. They positioned their entire force of elite cavalry directly on the lip of the riverbank, creating a dense, glittering wall of bronze, iron, and horseflesh that seemed utterly impenetrable. Behind them, far from the action on the flat ground of the plain, they placed Memnon's battle-hardened Greek mercenaries, the very infantry that would have been best suited to slaughtering the Macedonians as they struggled out of the water. Their logic, born of pure contempt, was that the Macedonians would be so disordered and exhausted by the river crossing that a single crushing downhill charge from their elite cavalry would be enough to annihilate them. It should have been a massacre, but it was a trap built on the fatal assumption that their enemy was a conventional man who would play by conventional rules. When Alexander and the vanguard of his army crested the final rise and looked down upon the Granicus River, he surveyed the scene not with the eyes of a king, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a born tactician. What he saw laid out before him should have given any reasonable commander a deep, chilling pause. The enemy held every conceivable advantage. Their superior numbers were arrayed in a glittering line of battle, calmly waiting. They held the high ground, a position of tactical dominance that made any assault an uphill struggle. His own army, by contrast, was weary, coated in the dust and sweat of a long day's march. To order a frontal assault across a fast-flowing river, up a steep and muddy bank, and directly into the teeth of an entrenched cavalry force violated every sacred principle of military common sense. It was a textbook definition of a suicide mission. At his side was Parmenion, the most seasoned general in the Macedonian army, and a loyal friend to his late father, Philip II. The old veteran, a man whose face was a roadmap of 100 campaigns, was visibly appalled by the sight. This grizzled commander had fought more battles than Alexander had years of life, and his experienced eye immediately grasped the lethal geometry of the Persian trap. He turned to his young king, his voice urgent and heavy with concern, and strongly advised against an immediate attack. He argued for making camp, resting the men, and launching an assault at dawn. A night's delay, he reasoned, could change everything. They might find an undefended crossing further upstream, or the Persians might grow complacent and abandon their perfect formation. His counsel was logical, prudent, and the absolute correct military advice in any conventional sense. The advice was not just militarily sound, it was a plea from a man who saw Alexander as both a king and a son. But the young monarch rejected it utterly, without a moment's hesitation. He turned to his worried general, his expression not of anger, but of unshakable resolve, and uttered the words that would define the moment. He declared that the Hellespont, the great sea he had just crossed, would blush for shame if he, having conquered a strait, were to be frightened by a mere stream like the Granicus. The dismissal was so swift, so total, that it must have sent a shock through the assembled officers. It was a clear signal that the old, cautious ways of Philip were over, and a new, more audacious era of warfare had begun. This was not simply the bravado of an arrogant youth. It was a profoundly calculated act of psychological warfare and leadership. Alexander possessed an innate, almost supernatural understanding that momentum was the lifeblood of his invasion. He knew that any hesitation, any pause to make camp would be a poison. To his enemies across the river, it would be seen as fear, a confirmation of their belief that he was just a boy. Their confidence would harden overnight, their discipline would tighten, and they might even receive reinforcements. To his own men, a delay would plant the first seeds of doubt. His army was a fragile coalition of Macedonians and skeptical Greeks, held together by the force of his personality and their belief in his destiny. To show fear now would be to admit that the invasion might fail. More fundamentally, Alexander understood that this single decision, here and now, would forge his reputation for the entirety of his campaign. He stood at a crossroads between two types of leadership. He could be a cautious, conventional king who won through methodical planning and attrition, the way of Parmenion, or he could be something else entirely. A heroic warrior king, a force of nature who achieved the impossible through sheer audacity and personal valour. He knew that a legend is not built on caution. A victory at dawn would be a simple military achievement. A victory now, against all odds, would be a miracle. It would create an aura of invincibility around him that would become a weapon more powerful than any spear. Therefore, the decision to attack immediately was quintessential Alexander, the first true demonstration of the lethal formula that would carry him across the known world. It was a sublime fusion of tactical insight and an instinct for the psychology of his foe, a belief that an enemy's greatest strength could be transformed into their greatest weakness. He looked at the perfect Persian defensive line and saw not an unbreakable wall, but a static, arrogant target waiting to be shattered. He was betting everything, his army, his kingdom, his life, and his legacy, on his unwavering belief that audacity itself was the sharpest weapon in his arsenal, capable of carving a path to victory where all other commanders saw only certain defeat. The tension is building, isn't it? Alexander is about to make a decision that will either forge his legend or end it before it begins. But first, let me know in the comments. Do you think Alexander's refusal to wait was brilliant strategy or reckless? Gambling? And don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal moments. The army Alexander had led into Asia was numerically small, a mere fraction of the vast host Persia could summon. But it was no simple barbarian horde. It was a professional combined arms military force that represented the absolute pinnacle of ancient military evolution. The heart and soul of this machine was its infantry, the Macedonian phalanx battalions. 6,000 of these hardened professionals, organized into 6 elite units called taxis, formed the unbreakable center. They were the product of a lifetime of grueling training and the revolutionary military reforms of Alexander's father, Philip II. Each man carried the fearsome 18-foot sarissa, a pike so long it required 2 hands to wield, creating a dense hedgehog of spear points that was all but invincible in a frontal assault. On the flat ground of a traditional battlefield, the phalanx was a human steamroller, a nearly impenetrable wall of bronze-tipped death that could grind any opposing infantry force into dust. But this was not a traditional battlefield. Crossing a fast-flowing river under a hail of enemy fire and then charging up a muddy, fortified embankment was a task for which the phalanx was uniquely ill-suited. Its strength lay in its cohesion and formation, both of which would be shattered by the river. For this assault, the phalanx would not be the tip of the spear, but the iron shaft that would follow. Alexander would need to rely on the more flexible and elite tools in his military arsenal to forge a path for them. The army was deployed with a specific deadly purpose in mind. On the left flank, under the steady, cautious command of the veteran Parmenion, Alexander positioned the heavy cavalry of his Greek allies, most notably the Thessalian horsemen. The Thessalians were legendary throughout the Hellenic world, master horsemen whose skill in the saddle was second only to the Macedonians themselves. Their mission was crucial but defensive. They were to act as an anchor, engaging and pinning the Persian right wing. Their job was not to seek a glorious breakthrough, but to hold their ground at all costs, preventing the numerically superior enemy from enveloping the Macedonian line or reinforcing the main point of attack. In the centre, the 6 battalions of the phalanx were arrayed, their forest of sarissas held upright, waiting in disciplined reserve on the Macedonian side of the river. They would not move until Alexander himself had punched a hole in the Persian line and secured a foothold on the opposite bank. The entire weight of the battle, the fate of the invasion itself, rested not on the infantry, but on the success of the cavalry. It was on the right flank where the real striking force, the decisive weapon, was being assembled. Here Alexander gathered the absolute cream of his army, a perfectly calibrated force designed for a single overwhelming hammer blow. Here were the Hypaspists, the shield-bearers, his personal foot guards who served as the flexible hinge between the cavalry and the phalanx. They were elite warriors who combined the discipline and armour of a hoplite with the speed and mobility of a skirmisher. Alongside them were his Agrianian javelin men, fierce mountain warriors from the Balkans who could traverse the roughest terrain like ghosts. And at the very tip of this spear was the pride of Macedonia, the most feared and respected cavalry unit in the ancient world, the Companion Cavalry. These 2,000 horsemen were the sons of the Macedonian aristocracy, nobles who had been raised at court with Alexander, who had trained with him since boyhood, and who were bound to him by an unbreakable oath of loyalty. The companions were not merely soldiers fighting for a king. They were a brotherhood of warriors fighting for one of their own, a band of brothers who shared his burning ambition for glory and conquest. Their loyalty was absolute, their courage unquestioned, and their battlefield synergy was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was here, at the head of this elite unit, that Alexander made a decision so remarkable, so contrary to the norms of kingship, that it sent a visible shockwave through both armies. Instead of commanding from a safe position in the rear, as was the custom for any sane general or king, he rode to the very front of the lead squadron, placing himself at the apex of the charging wedge. He would not simply order the attack, he would be the first man across the river, the first to feel the spray of the water, the first to meet the enemy's steel. This single act revealed the very essence of Alexander's almost mythical leadership. He understood a profound truth of men in combat, that courage is a fire and it spreads from the top down. He knew that men will gladly walk into the jaws of death for a leader who asks nothing of them that he is not willing to do himself. By placing his own life in the most extreme and immediate danger, he transformed the coming charge from a mere tactical maneuver into a sacred duty. His men would not just be fighting for victory, they would be fighting with the desperate, frenzied valour of soldiers whose every action was dedicated to protecting the life of their beloved king. The battle did not begin with the thunderous head-on collision that the Persians expected. It began instead with a subtle, calculated and masterful act of deception. With a quiet command, Alexander dispatched a small, hand-picked force of light infantry and a squadron of cavalry under the command of an officer named Socrates. This advance guard, perhaps no more than 300 men, was ordered to charge across the river, but significantly upstream from Alexander's main position on the right flank. With a disciplined roar, this sacrificial unit plunged into the churning river, their shields held high as they fought the current and scrambled up the opposite bank, directly into the strongest part of the waiting Persian line. The Persian commanders reacted with the predictable arrogance Alexander had counted on. Seeing a small force attacking their strongest point, they believed this was the main, albeit suicidal, Macedonian assault. Eager to crush the attack and claim an easy victory, Persian cavalry squadrons from the centre and left converged on the point of the assault, abandoning their prepared positions to overwhelm the small Macedonian force. The fighting on the riverbank was a brief, brutal, and utterly one-sided affair. The outnumbered Macedonians were annihilated, driven back into the river with horrific casualties. Men were impaled by javelins, pulled from their horses into the swift current, and drowned under the weight of their own armour. But in their heroic deaths, they had accomplished their mission with perfect lethal precision. They had drawn the eye of the entire Persian army. The Persian commanders, their attention now tunnel-visioned on this single point of action, were completely fixated on the wrong part of the battlefield. Crucially, their elite cavalry squadrons had shifted, clustering into a dense, disorganized mass to deal with the decoy. In doing so, they had fatally weakened and exposed the centre-left of their own line, creating the exact point of vulnerability Alexander had been waiting for. It was a classic magician's trick, forcing the audience to look at one hand while the other prepares the real, deadly manoeuvre. While the Persians were still congratulating themselves on repelling the first assault, Alexander unleashed his true attack. With a single, sharp command, he spurred his own horse forward, leading the entire companion cavalry not in a straight line, but in a diagonal charge across the river. This oblique angle was a stroke of genius. It was the shortest path to the weakened section of the enemy line and gave the Persians the minimum possible time to react. The famous wedge formation of the companions, an arrowhead of steel and courage designed to punch through enemy lines, plunged into the river with Alexander himself at its very tip. The sight must have been one of terrifying, sublime glory. Alexander, a figure of almost divine radiance in his polished bronze cuirass and distinctive helmet adorned with two large white plumes, was an unmistakable beacon leading the charge. He spurred his legendary warhorse Bucephalus into the churning chest-deep water without a flicker of hesitation. Behind him, a wave of over 1,000 of Macedonia's finest nobles crashed into the river, their thunderous battle cry of Enyalios, an invocation to the god of war echoing across the valley. The sound alone was a weapon, a declaration that this was no mere feint. This was the hammer blow, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the Persian army. The crossing itself was a maelstrom of organized chaos. The powerful current of the Granicus threatened to tear the wedge formation apart, as horses struggled for footing on the rocky riverbed and their riders fought to maintain cohesion under a relentless storm of Persian javelins. The air was thick with the hiss of projectiles and the splash of water as men and animals were struck. The steep, muddy bank on the Persian side was a treacherous final obstacle, causing horses to slip and fall, throwing their heavily armoured riders into the water to drown. The perfect, disciplined arrowhead that had entered the river began to fragment under the sheer, brutal stress of the crossing. But Alexander's timing the result of a predatory instinct for the rhythm of battle, was flawless. The Persian commanders, their eyes still drawn to the upstream feint, took precious seconds to comprehend the true nature of the threat that was now emerging from the water, directly in front of them. By the time they frantically shouted orders and tried to wheel their disorganized cavalry squadrons to face the real attack, it was already too late. Alexander and the first wave of his companions had weathered the storm. They had reached the bank and were scrambling up the slippery slope, a snarling, desperate mass of men and horses, still led by the indomitable figure of their king. The trap had been sprung, and the jaws were about to close. The very instant the first hooves of the companion cavalry found purchase on the high riverbank, the battle degenerated into a savage close-quarters melee. This was cavalry combat at its most primal and deadly, a swirling claustrophobic vortex of stabbing lances, slashing swords, rearing horses, and the desperate screams of men. The Macedonians wielded their superior ziston, a 12-foot lance of tough cornel wood, giving them a crucial advantage in reach and shocking power over the Persians, who primarily used lighter, throwing javelins. But in the chaotic, churning press of a life-or-death struggle, where there was no room to maneuver, such tactical advantages could vanish in a heartbeat. True to his word and his very nature, Alexander was a whirlwind of destruction at the heart of the fighting, a beacon of ferocious energy leading from the absolute front. He was not just a king, he was a predator, his eyes scanning the enemy ranks for high-value targets. He immediately identified Mithridates, the son-in-law of the Persian king Darius himself, and spurred Bucephalus directly at him. There was no hesitation. In a single, explosive charge, Alexander drove his lance through the Persian noble's shield, through his armour and deep into his chest, killing him instantly. But in this moment of lethal triumph, as he wrenched his weapon free from his fallen foe, disaster struck. As Alexander fought to pull his weapon free, he found himself suddenly and terrifyingly isolated, his forward momentum having carried him deep into a pocket of enraged Persian nobles. He was now a lone target for two of their most powerful satraps, Rusaces and Spithridates. At that exact moment, the shaft of his lance, strained by the fatal blow to Mithridates, shattered in his hands, leaving him momentarily defenceless with only a sword to hand. Rusaces, seeing his chance, charged in and swung a heavy battle-axe with all his might. The blow caught Alexander's helmet with a deafening clang of metal on metal. The sheer force sheared off the iconic white plumes, cracked the thick bronze of the helmet itself, and sent a blinding, concussive shock through the young king's entire body. Stunned and reeling from the blow, the world swimming before his eyes, Alexander struggled to stay on his horse. As Rusaces raised his axe again for the final killing blow, Spithridates manoeuvred his horse to attack the dazed king from behind, his curved Persian scimitar glinting in the afternoon sun as he prepared to deliver the fatal strike. For one agonizing, suspended moment, the entire future of Western civilization hung by a single fragile thread. If Alexander died here, in the mud of this provincial riverbank, his invasion would collapse into chaos. His kingdom of Macedonia would likely fragment into civil war, and the mighty Persian Empire would continue its unchallenged dominance for generations to come. The history of the world would be rewritten. But in that critical final second, one of Alexander's companions, Cleitus the Black, a man who had grown up with his king, crashed into the fray like a thunderbolt. Seeing his king's peril, Cleitus galloped through the chaos with a single-minded purpose. Just as Spithridates' sword began its downward arc, Cleitus, with a single, powerful sweep of his own blade, severed the Persian satrap's arm at the shoulder. The limb, still clutching its sword, spun through the air. The Persian noble's shriek of pure agony was swallowed by the deafening roar of the battle, but his dramatic fall from his horse marked the psychological turning point of the entire engagement. The sight of several of their most powerful commanders being cut down in single combat, combined with the sheer, terrifying ferocity of Alexander's personal charge, began to shatter Persian morale. These were proud, brave men, fighting for their honour and their land, but they were confronted with a phenomenon that defied their entire understanding of warfare. They were facing a king who fought not like a distant commander, but like a ferocious berserker from the heroic age, a leader backed by an army whose absolute loyalty and devotion bordered on the fanatical. The foundation of their confidence began to crack, and a seed of terror was planted. Perhaps this was not a mere mortal they were fighting, but a demigod of war itself. The magnificent Persian cavalry line, which only moments before had seemed like an unbreakable, glittering wall of imperial power, began to groan and buckle under the relentless, focused pressure of the Macedonian assault. The initial breakthrough carved out by Alexander and his royal squadron was like a crack appearing in a sheet of thick ice. For a moment it was a localized rupture, but the companions, fighting with the fury of men defending their king, relentlessly exploited the opening, widening it with every spear thrust. The fracture spread rapidly, running down the Persian line as first one noble squadron, then another, recoiled from the sheer ferocity of the Macedonians and began to give ground. The psychological impact of seeing their most powerful satraps and commanders slain in single combat by Alexander himself cannot be overstated. In the ancient world, warfare was not merely a tactical exercise. It was a deeply spiritual and superstitious affair. Battles were often seen as a trial by combat between the gods of the opposing armies. Alexander's miraculous survival from a direct axe blow to the head, coupled with his visible personal slaughter of their finest champions, created a powerful and terrifying narrative. The impression rippled through the Persian ranks with the speed of panic. The gods themselves were clearly fighting for the young Macedonian king. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a divine judgment, and they were on the losing side. The final collapse, when it came, was not a gradual retreat, but a sudden, catastrophic implosion of morale. The dam of Persian courage broke completely. The elite cavalry, moments before confident in their impregnable position and superior numbers, shattered in a wave of blind panic. What had been an organized, disciplined defensive line disintegrated into a terrified, disorganized mob of thousands of fleeing horsemen. They streamed away from the riverbank and across the open plain, each man desperately fighting his way through the press of his own comrades in a frantic flight for his life. The battle for the river was over. The slaughter was about to begin. Alexander, his helmet cracked and his body bloodied, but his spirit blazing with victory, did not pause to celebrate. He immediately unleashed his cavalry in a relentless, merciless pursuit of the routing enemy. This was a standard, brutal doctrine of ancient warfare, taught to him by his father. A broken army is most vulnerable during its retreat, and it is during the chase that a victory is transformed into an annihilation. The companion cavalry, their blood still singing from the ferocity of the fight, spurred their weary horses onward. They pursued the fleeing Persians for miles across the countryside, cutting them down from behind with a methodical, terrifying efficiency, turning the green plains of Phrygia red with enemy blood. As the chaos of the pursuit unfolded, the 10,000 Greek mercenaries found themselves in a sudden and utterly impossible position. These were professional battle-hardened hoplites, the anchor of the Persian army, who'd been held in reserve on the plain behind the river. According to the original Persian plan, they were supposed to be the anvil upon which the cavalry hammer would smash the Macedonians. Instead, they could only watch in stunned horror as their cavalry support evaporated in a cloud of dust, and their Persian employers abandoned them to their fate. They were now an island of infantry, completely isolated in a sea of victorious Macedonians. These mercenaries were not cowards. They were grizzled veterans of 100 brutal campaigns across the Greek world, men who sold their spears to the highest bidder. They quickly formed up into a defensive posture, a solid block of shields and spears ready to fight. Under normal circumstances as fellow Greeks, they sort of expected to negotiate for honourable terms of surrender, perhaps to be ransomed or even offered a place in the victor's army. But they were about to discover that Alexander, in this moment of absolute triumph, was in no mood for the conventional courtesies of Hellenic warfare. To him they were not just enemies, they were something far worse. What unfolded on the plain in the aftermath of the cavalry battle revealed a colder, harder, and far more ruthless side of Alexander's character, a trait that would emerge time and again throughout his long and bloody conquest of Asia. As the victorious Macedonian cavalry returned from their pursuit, the great phalanx battalions finally crossed the Granicus unopposed. They methodically deployed on the plain, their lines perfectly dressed, their sarissas lowered to form a dense, impenetrable forest of steel. They moved with a chilling, mechanical precision, completely encircling the trapped Greek mercenaries. Seeing the ring of death closing in around them, the veteran hoplites, knowing the fight was lost, grounded their spears and attempted to negotiate for terms of surrender. From Alexander's perspective, however, this was not a negotiation between honourable opponents. He looked upon the surrounded men not as enemy soldiers, but as something far more contemptible. They were traitors to the entire Hellenic world. These were Greeks who had taken the blood money of the Persian king, pledging their spears to the very empire that had desecrated Greek temples and sought to enslave their people. They were a direct affront to the grand pan-Hellenic crusade of revenge that served as the entire moral and political justification for his invasion. In the cold calculus of his mind, they had forfeited their right to be treated as Greeks. They deserved no mercy. The mercenaries, grizzled professionals who could read the grim language of a battlefield, quickly realized the depth of their peril. Desperation set in. They sent forth envoys, pleading their case and trying every diplomatic avenue they could conceive of. They offered to pay a handsome ransom for their lives. They offered to switch their allegiance and serve loyally in Alexander's own army, their combat experience a valuable asset. They appealed to the shared customs of Hellenic warfare, which traditionally allowed for the ransoming of captured soldiers. But the young king, his face set like stone, remained utterly inflexible. His response was delivered without negotiation, unconditional surrender, or total annihilation. What followed was not a battle in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a methodical, industrial-scale slaughter. Enraged by what he saw as their treason, Alexander dismounted and is said to have led his infantry on foot in the final, brutal assault. The Macedonian phalanx advanced from all sides, a slowly contracting circle of death. The mercenaries, armed with their much shorter 8-foot hoplite spears, were tactically helpless. They could not break through the dense wall of 18-foot sarissas, nor could they get close enough to effectively use their own weapons. It was a horrific, one-sided extermination, as the Macedonians systematically butchered the trapped and helpless men. The ancient historical accounts, though varying in their exact numbers, paint a grim picture of the carnage. Of the roughly 10,000 professional Greek soldiers who had stood on that plain, it is believed that only 2,000 survived the massacre. These were not ransomed or treated as prisoners of war. They were stripped of their arms and armour, bound in chains, and sent back to Macedon to live out the rest of their miserable lives as slaves, condemned to hard labour in the silver mines. The message to the rest of the Greek world was as clear as it was terrifying. If you fight for Persia, if you betray the Hellenic cause, you can expect no quarter from Alexander. This act of calculated, ruthless brutality was far more than a simple fit of vengeful rage. It served several key strategic purposes. Firstly, it sent a chilling warning to every other Greek mercenary serving in the vast Persian Empire, forcing them to question their loyalty. Secondly, it demonstrated to the fiercely independent and often rebellious city-states of mainland Greece that there would be severe and immediate consequences for collaborating with their old enemy. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it forged a new and fearsome dimension to Alexander's reputation. It established him in the minds of allies and enemies alike as a leader of stark dualities, a man of incredible generosity and loyalty to his friends, but one of absolute merciless brutality to those he deemed traitors. As the last rays of the sun set over the Granicus River on that fateful spring day in 334 BC, the light illuminated a scene of almost unimaginable carnage and the dawn of a new era. The ancient world had been irrevocably altered. In the space of a single brutal afternoon, Alexander had not only achieved what seemed impossible, but had shattered the very foundation of Persian power in the West. He had confronted and utterly destroyed the first great army the Persian Empire had sent against him, effectively eliminating in one stroke virtually all organised military resistance to his invasion of Asia Minor. The path into the heartland of the empire now lay open. The stark, chilling arithmetic of the casualty figures tells the story of the battle's completely one-sided conclusion. The Persian losses were nothing short of catastrophic. Thousands of their finest aristocratic cavalry lay dead on the field, a generation of the region's nobility wiped out. Their entire professional mercenary infantry corps, the hardened backbone of their army, had been annihilated to a man. Most critically, the satraps and high commanders who had so arrogantly dismissed the young king were almost all dead, fallen in the chaos of the battle. By stunning contrast, the Macedonian casualties were almost miraculously light. Ancient sources claim perhaps just over 100 of Alexander's men were killed in total, the majority of those losses coming from the heroic, sacrificial feint that had initiated the battle. But the true, world-altering significance of the victory at the Granicus went far beyond the grim calculus of the dead. This battle was Alexander's first and most critical test as a supreme, independent commander, and he had passed it with breathtaking audacity. He had proven to his men, to his enemies, and to himself that he could lead an army into a seemingly impossible tactical situation and emerge completely victorious. He had demonstrated a mastery of combined arms, a genius for psychological warfare, and a level of personal courage that bordered on the divine. The legend forged in the blood and mud of the Granicus would now become his vanguard, a wave of terror and awe that would precede him into every future campaign, often compelling enemies to surrender before a single sword was even drawn. The political consequences of the victory were immediate, seismic, and far-reaching. With the Persian field army utterly destroyed, and its leadership decapitated, the wealthy Greek cities that dotted the coast of Asia Minor found themselves suddenly and completely defenceless. The imperial authority that had governed their lives for generations had vanished overnight. One by one, great cities like Sardis and Ephesus would throw open their gates to Alexander, their populations often welcoming him not as a conqueror but as a liberator from the yoke of Persian rule. For others, it was a simple pragmatic recognition that any and all resistance was now utterly futile against this new, seemingly invincible power. More importantly, the victory at the Granicus established the very patterns of leadership and strategy that would come to define Alexander's entire legendary career. His willingness to accept and even seek out enormous personal risks to inspire his men, his innate ability to cultivate a fanatical, almost religious loyalty in his troops, his lethal combination of dazzling tactical brilliance on the battlefield and a cold, ruthless pragmatism in its aftermath. All of these core traits of his genius were on full display at the Granicus. They would be repeated and amplified on a grander scale in the even greater battles that were yet to come, at Issus, Gaugamela, and beyond. Finally, the battle sent a profound shockwave through the geopolitical landscape of the age. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, which had stood as the world's preeminent superpower for over 2 centuries, had been revealed to be a vulnerable colossus. The old established rules of engagement, which relied on overwhelming numerical superiority and holding the positional advantage, had been proven catastrophically inadequate. Persia had just been introduced to a new, terrifying paradigm of warfare, one waged by a leader who fused tactical innovation with a brand of inspirational personal leadership that seemed to belong to the age of heroes. The world had been put on notice. A new and far more dangerous predator was now on the hunt. The Battle of the Granicus River was far more than a mere military victory. It was a crucible. It was the precise, fiery moment in which Alexander III of Macedon, the promising but unproven young king, was burned away, and from the ashes, Alexander the Great was truly born. Before that bloody afternoon, he had been a monarch with a grand, almost fantastical ambition and deeply uncertain prospects. He was Philip's son, a leader with a powerful inheritance but no legend of his own. But after he spurred his horse into that river, after he took an axe to the helmet and emerged victorious, he became something else entirely. He was transformed into a figure of myth, a living legend whose very name would soon become a weapon, capable of striking terror into the hearts of his enemies and inspiring a fervent, unshakable devotion in his followers. The story of the battle, in all its dramatic and heroic details, spread like wildfire across the ancient world. It travelled along the dusty caravan routes, was carried on the decks of merchant ships, and was recounted in the courts of distant kings by stunned diplomats and awestruck soldiers. Each retelling inevitably amplified the most legendary details, the impossible odds, the suicidal nature of the charge, the sheer personal courage of the king, who fought at the very front, and the absolute, almost contemptuous destruction of the Persian host. Within a matter of months, from the ancient temples of Egypt to the royal courts of India, rulers and commoners alike were hearing the whispered, incredible accounts of the young Western king, who seemed to be a reincarnation of Achilles, a warrior who led his own cavalry charges and was seemingly incapable of losing a battle. This carefully cultivated and rapidly spreading reputation would become one of Alexander's most potent and effective weapons, a force multiplier that was as valuable as any phalanx. In the years to come, future enemies would march to face him already half defeated. their morale eroded by the terrifying legend that preceded him. They knew they were facing not just a skilled general, but a man who seemed to enjoy the direct protection of the gods. Conversely, potential allies and undecided city-states would flock to his banners, eager to attach their fortunes to a leader who seemed to be an avatar of certain victory. He was no longer just a man waging a war. He was a force of destiny, and it was far better to be on his side than in his path. The profound psychological impact on Alexander himself was equally significant and transformative. The stunning success at Granicus, achieved against all conventional wisdom, served as an irrefutable confirmation of his deepest, most secret beliefs about himself. It solidified his conviction that he was not like other men, that he was indeed a child of destiny, chosen and favoured by the gods for the singular purpose of the world conquest. This supreme, almost terrifying self-confidence would become the engine that would drive him forward through a decade of relentless warfare, pushing him across scorching deserts and over frozen mountains, sustaining him through victories and near disasters that would have shattered the will and spirit of any lesser man. But perhaps most importantly, the victory at the Granicus established the definitive, unshakable template for the leadership style that would define his entire career. It was on this day that Alexander learned, in the most visceral and immediate way possible, a set of lessons that would become his guiding principles. He had proven that audacity could shatter caution. He had learned that profound personal courage could overcome a significant numerical disadvantage, and he had discovered that a single, decisive action delivered at the perfect psychological moment could completely reshape the entire strategic landscape. The boy who charged across the river had become a man who now knew, with absolute certainty, how he would conquer the world. In the final analysis, the charge at the Granicus River was many things at once. It was a tactical masterpiece of timing and deception. It was a stunning propaganda victory that announced his arrival on the world stage. And it was a moment of supreme, almost unbelievable personal courage. But above all else, it was the single brilliant spark that ignited one of the most extraordinary careers in all of human history. In his deliberate choice to attack immediately, in his profound decision to place himself at the very front of the charge, and in his defiant refusal to accept the conventional wisdom of what was possible, Alexander had broadcast an unmistakable message to the entire world. The old rules were broken, and a new and terrifying force of history had arrived. The 21-year-old king who plunged his warhorse into the churning waters of the Granicus that afternoon would, in the decade that followed, completely redraw the map of the known world. He would shatter the Persian Empire, march his armies to the edge of India, found dozens of cities that would become beacons of culture for centuries, and unleash the historical tidal wave of Hellenism that would forever change the course of Western and Eastern civilization. But that entire world-altering avalanche began here, with a single stone of audacious decision-making. It all hinged on one desperate cavalry charge that, by every sane calculation, should have ended in nothing but disaster. The Battle of Granicus serves as a timeless and brutal lesson that history's most monumental achievements often demand the rejection of the safe, the sensible, and the conventional choice. Alexander could have listened to Parmenion, the voice of logic and experience. He could have waited for the safety of the dawn, sought a less defended crossing, and followed the prudent orthodox rules of war. Instead, he chose to gamble everything he had, his life, his army, his kingdom, on his own ferocious belief that he could turn a hopeless disadvantage into a history-making victory through the sheer, unstoppable force of his will and the brilliance of his tactical mind. Was it reckless? By any rational standard, it was an act of strategic insanity. Could his entire career and his life have been extinguished in that riverbank melee? Without question. If Cleitus the Black had been a second slower, the name Alexander would be a forgotten footnote. But it is the very magnitude of that risk that makes the story legendary. It teaches us that sometimes the razor-thin line between obscurity and immortality is drawn in a single heart-stopping moment. A moment when a leader must choose courage over caution, immediate action over prolonged hesitation, and the seemingly impossible over the merely difficult. And so, as we face our own challenges in a world of complexity and uncertainty, perhaps we can draw a sliver of inspiration from that young king, standing at the edge of a muddy river thousands of years ago. The dust of a long march was on his armour, and the entire weight of his kingdom's future was on his shoulders. He knew everything he had ever worked for hung in the balance, and yet he chose to charge forward anyway. He did not charge because it was safe, but because it was necessary for the legend he wished to create. He did not charge because success was guaranteed, but because true greatness never is. What do you think? Was Alexander's charge at Granicus the mark of a military genius, or was he just incredibly lucky that his reckless gamble paid off? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic tales from history. Next week we'll be exploring another moment when everything hung in the balance, and one person's decision changed the world forever. Until then, keep charging forward, and I'll see you in the next one.